June 6, 1944, 0020 hours. Somewhere over the Normandy coast, Lieutenant Norman Poole tumbled unconscious through 800 feet of black sky. His head had struck the belly hatch of the Halifax bomber on exit. Blood streamed across his face. Below him, 200 burlap dolls stuffed with sand and straw drifted toward German-occupied France. Each one carried enough explosive to burn itself into ash. Within minutes, they would trigger the largest tactical panic in modern warfare. Before we dive into this incredible story, if you're enjoying this deep look into history's most brilliant deceptions, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from, whether you're in London, Los Angeles, or somewhere in between. Your support helps us bring these forgotten stories to light. Now, let's get back to June 6, 1944. Poole woke an hour later in a muddy field, alone in enemy territory. His head throbbed, his radio was smashed. Somewhere in the darkness, his 5-man team was scattered across the French countryside with portable gramophones and recordings of battle sounds. Their mission seemed absurd even to the officers who planned it. Drop cloth dummies behind enemy lines. Play sounds of gunfire. Hope the Germans would panic. Critics within the Special Air Service had called it a suicide mission wrapped in farce. But as Poole lay in that field, trying to remember his own name, German commanders across Normandy were already redeploying entire divisions to counter what they believed was a massive airborne invasion. The dolls were working, and in that moment, though Poole didn't know it yet, those burlap bags were buying time measured in alive lives. The idea had emerged from desperation, not genius. By early 1944, Allied planners knew the mathematics of D-Day were brutal. Intelligence estimated that German coastal defenses in Normandy included 31,000 troops in the immediate landing zones. The 352nd Infantry Division alone maintained 9 full battalions when most German divisions had been reduced to 6. They occupied 8 concrete bunkers, 35 pillboxes, and 85 machine gun nests overlooking the beaches. Behind them waited the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend with 20,540 troops, 229 tanks, and 658 half-tracks. If those panzers reached the beaches during the first 6 hours, the invasion could collapse. Standard military doctrine in 1944 emphasized elaborate deception. The Americans had created an entire ghost army complete with inflatable tanks and fake radio traffic. Operation Fortitude South had conjured a fictional 1st United States Army group under Patton, visible from German reconnaissance aircraft. Military theorists argued deceptions needed technical sophistication to withstand scrutiny, but a small team within RAF Bomber Command saw a different truth. They understood that German commanders wouldn't be examining evidence in daylight laboratories. They would be making split-second decisions in darkness, under pressure, with incomplete information flooding in from terrified soldiers. The solution they proposed seemed almost insulting in its simplicity. Build dolls barely 3 feet tall, stuff them with sand and straw, fit them with timed explosives and noise makers, drop them behind enemy lines and let German psychology do the rest. When Wing Commander J.H. Costin first presented the concept to senior officers, several dismissed it as theatrical nonsense. Sending highly trained SAS commandos to activate gramophone players seemed like something from a music hall comedy, not a serious military operation. But Costin had done his research. He knew that visual perspective collapses in darkness. A 3-foot dummy descending under a parachute creates exactly the same silhouette against a black sky as a full-size soldier. The dolls were christened Ruperts by the British and Oscars by the Americans. They cost perhaps £2 each to manufacture. Each consisted of hollow Hessian bags tied together with string, filled with whatever sand and straw were available. Some bags still bore printed markings from supply sacks. The total weight per dummy was light enough that crews could stack dozens in each aircraft, but the genius lay in the details. Inside each hollow limb, engineers fitted small timed explosive charges designed to burn rather than blast. Upon landing, The timer would ignite the Hessian and straw, creating a flash and smoke that simulated a paratrooper burning his parachute, standard practice for real airborne forces. Attached behind each parachute hung a device called a pinetail. It used mechanical timing to produce 10 minutes of intermittent cracking sounds that convincingly mimic rifle fire. Some Ruperts were even dressed in partial uniforms, boots and helmets, so any fragments surviving the fire would be more convincing to German patrols. The entire deception package was brutally simple. It had to be. There was no time for sophistication. The invasion was weeks away, and someone had to make sure German reserves were looking the wrong direction when the real paratroopers came down. Operation Titanic was divided into 4 phases across Normandy. Titanic I would drop 200 dummies north of the Seine River near Vertas, simulating an entire airborne division landing far from the actual beaches. Titanic 3 would drop 50 near Maltet, southwest of Caen. Titanic 4, Poole's mission, would drop 200 near Marigny in the Cotentin Peninsula. Titanic 2, planned for east of the River Dives, was cancelled at the last moment due to excessive air traffic. 40 aircraft from 4 RAF squadrons would deliver the packages. Numbers 138, 161, 90, and 149 Squadron flew Hudsons, Halifaxes, and Stirlings into the night, loaded with burlap and hope. Accompanying the dolls were 12 actual SAS soldiers divided into 2 6-man teams. Captain Frederick Fowles commanded one team. Lieutenant Norman Poole commanded the other. They carried portable gramophones with special amplifiers, loaded with 30-minute recordings of battle sounds, shouted commands in English, rifle fire, machine guns, mortar explosions, the chaos of men organizing in darkness. Their orders were explicit and counterintuitive. Engage any German patrol that came to investigate, but deliberately allow some Germans to escape. The escaped soldiers would rush back to headquarters and report a large-scale airborne landing. The deception only worked if it spread through the German command structure like a virus. The mission went wrong from the first moments. Poole, exiting through the belly hatch, caught his head on the rim and tumbled unconscious into the night sky. He awoke alone in a field an hour later, his equipment scattered, his team missing. Captain Fowles landed safely, but in a different field, unable to find his men in the darkness. For troopers, Dawson, Sawyers, Hurst, and Merriweather waited in a ruined abbey, having lost contact with both officers. They had dropped equipment containers filled with the gramophones and ammunition, but couldn't locate them in the blackness. Only through the assistance of a French civilian did Poole rejoin his team the following day. Fowles appeared the day after that. The operation was falling apart before it had properly begun. Yet even this chaos served the deception. At 00:00 hours on June 6th, German units across Normandy began reporting parachute landings east of Caen and in the Coutances, Valognes, and Isigny areas. The reports arrived together, creating the impression of a massive coordinated assault across a huge frontage. In response, 7th Army Headquarters ordered increased readiness levels and warned to expect invasion within hours. General Hans Speidel, Chief of Staff to Rommel, initially decreased the alert level when early patrols reported finding only dummy parachutists. But the damage had already been done, orders had been issued, troops were moving. And once military bureaucracy begins turning, it's almost impossible to stop. Field Marshal Gerhard von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, ordered over half of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend to deal with a reported parachute landing on the coast near Lisieux. The landing turned out to be dummies from Titanic 3, but von Rundstedt didn't know that at 03:00 hours when he made the decision. He knew the Allies had been planning invasion for months. He knew airborne forces always spearheaded major assaults. He knew that ignoring a parachute landing could result in his coastal defenses being surrounded and destroyed from behind. So he did what any competent commander would do. He sent his armor to investigate. The Hitlerjugend, with its 229 tanks and 658 half-tracks, was one of only two panzer divisions positioned close enough to the beaches to potentially crush the invasion on D-Day itself. Von Rundstedt's orders sent them chasing ghosts, while actual Allied troops were fighting their way off the sand. The division wasn't redirected to the real front until 14:30 hours, over 12 hours, after the first landing reports. By then, Allied forces were consolidating their beachheads. American engineers were blowing gaps in the beach obstacles. British troops were pushing inland from Gold and Sword. The critical window had closed. Near Marigny, the Titanic for Dummies, supported by Poole's scattered team, diverted a Kampfruppe from the 915th Grenadier Regiment. This battle group was the only reserve element of the 352nd Infantry Division, which was defending Omaha and Gold Beaches. At 03:00 hours on June 6th, while American troops were still 3.5 hours from touching Omaha Beach, this Kampfruppe was sent eastward to counter an airborne threat near Isigny. They spent the entire morning searching woods for the spurious Titanic parachutists. They even exchanged fire with Poole's SAS team and their gramophone recordings echoing through the trees. By the time the 915th was redirected to Omaha Beach, American troops had secured the beachhead at terrible cost. Bodies lay in the surf, burning vehicles smoked on the sand. Medics worked frantically in the dunes, but the beachhead held, and part of the reason it held was because German reserves that should have counterattacked at dawn were instead hunting burl apdals in the woods 15 miles away. The men who died at Omaha never knew that cloth and straw had bought them precious hours. History rarely works that cleanly, but the numbers don't lie. Enigma intercepts from the area of Titanic I revealed German commanders reporting a major landing up the coast from Le Havre, well north of the actual invasion beaches. Communications had been cut. The SAS teams had severed telephone lines during their first night on the ground. German signals intelligence was intercepting radio traffic and hearing what sounded like battalion-level organization. The gramophone players, hidden in hedgerows and ruins, played their 30-minute loops while the SAS men moved position, set up again, played another loop. To German listeners, it sounded like multiple units coordinating across several kilometers. They reported these findings up the chain. And higher headquarters, already drowning in conflicting reports, added this to the intelligence picture. The result was strategic paralysis at the worst possible moment. The success of Operation Titanic wasn't about the quality of the dummies. It was about exploiting the fundamental problem of command and control in warfare. German commanders in Normandy faced what military theorists call the fog of war: incomplete information, conflicting reports, and pressure to make immediate decisions with potentially catastrophic consequences. When reports came in of parachute landings across multiple locations simultaneously, they couldn't simply ignore them. Each report required investigation. Investigation required diverting troops. And every diverted unit was one fewer defending against the real invasion. Battlefields aren't testing ranges where equipment can be carefully examined. They're chaotic environments where commanders make decisions based on fragments of information transmitted through stressed, frightened soldiers who may have glimpsed something for only seconds in darkness. A German sentry posted on the Normandy coast in the early hours of June 6 didn't have time to study falling parachutes. He saw shapes descending, he heard gunfire, the pinetails. He possibly heard shouted commands, the gramophones. He saw explosions and fires, the self-destructing dummies. He did exactly what his training demanded. He reported an enemy landing. And once that report entered the German command system, it had to be acted upon. Field commanders couldn't dismiss intelligence suggesting major airborne landings. If they were wrong, if a real British division was assembling in the woods, their defensive positions could be surrounded and destroyed. The genius of Titanic was forcing German commanders to make the safe choice every time. Investigate every report, divert reserves to counter every potential threat. Each decision was individually rational. Collectively, they paralyzed the German response during the hours when it mattered most. This wasn't incompetence. It was good commanders making logical decisions based on information that happened to be false. Poole and his team spent 40 days behind German lines, constantly moving to avoid capture. They had been told to expect rescue within 7 to 10 days as American forces advanced through the Cotentin Peninsula. Instead, they found themselves deep in enemy territory long after the initial invasion succeeded. Assisted by the French resistance, they cut telephone lines, transmitted radio reports of German troop movements, and even rescued for American prisoners 3 paratroopers from the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment who had escaped when their transport lorry was strafed by Allied aircraft. One American was badly wounded and had to be carried the entire journey by Trooper Merriweather. When German forces captured a French resistance operative named André Leserf, who had been helping the SAS men, they extracted enough information to dispatch a specially trained anti-parachute company to hunt them down. The net was closing. The SAS team's final attempt to reach Allied lines ended in an ambush. They were surrounded in a barn near Dinge, captured, and separated. Poole used his fluency in German to convince his SS interrogator they were regular infantrymen, not special forces. The Lee saved his life and that of one other commando, but it didn't save the others. Of the 12 SAS soldiers dropped for Operation Titanic, only 3 survived the war. 8 were either killed in action or executed. Some died at Belsen-Bergen concentration camp after being identified as special forces. The 2 Sterling aircraft lost during Titanic 3 went down with all crew. In the words of a post-war SAS regimental history, in the regiment, Titanic is remembered as a disaster, for a sound regimental reason. Of the 10 men who went on it, only 2 came back. The operation was tactically brilliant and strategically successful. But for the men who executed it, the cost was almost total. The 500 Ruperts dropped on D-Day cost perhaps £1,000 in total, the equivalent of a few artillery shells. The 12 SAS soldiers who jumped with them were volunteers, aware they were likely on a suicide mission. 8 never came home. But those 500 cloth dolls and 12 brave men tied up thousands of German troops and dozens of tanks during the hours when the invasion hung in the balance. As military historian M.R.D. Foote later wrote, it was a masterpiece of successful deception, not because it was sophisticated, but because it understood what mattered. The lesson of Operation Titanic wasn't that clever tricks could replace combat power. It was that warfare is fundamentally psychological. The best tank divisions in the world are useless if they're sent to the wrong battlefield. The most elaborate fortifications provide no protection if the defenders are looking the wrong way. The Germans didn't lose Normandy because they lacked equipment or courage. They lost because in the critical first hours, their command structure made perfectly rational decisions based on information that turned out to be false. And that false information came from crude dolls that cost less to make than the helmets worn by the soldiers hunting them. Critics had argued elaborate deceptions like Fortitude South, with their fictional army groups and fake radio traffic, were what really fooled the German high command. They were right about the strategic level. Hitler and OKW remained convinced for weeks that Normandy was a feint and the real invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais. But Titanic operated at the tactical level, where it mattered most in the first 24 hours. The 12th SS Panzer Division chasing dummies near Lisieux. The 915th Grenadier Regiment searching woods near Isigny. These weren't troops tricked by sophisticated intelligence operations. They were troops responding to immediate tactical threats that turned out to be Hessian bags filled with straw. Years after the war, a German officer who had been stationed near Isigny on D-Day recalled the morning of June 6 in his diary. He described the confusion, the conflicting reports, the sense that attacks were happening everywhere at once. He remembered seeing parachutes in the pre-dawn darkness and hearing gunfire echoing from the woods. He remembered the order to investigate, the march through muddy fields, the discovery of burnt fabric and metal fragments. He remembered thinking it might be a trick, but by then, more reports were coming in. Real paratroopers had been spotted to the east. Naval guns were shelling the coast. The invasion had begun. And his unit was 15 kilometers from where they were needed, chasing ghosts. He never learned the ghosts were deliberate. He never knew about the Ruperts, or the pinetails, or the gramophones playing in the hedgerows. He died in the 1970s, believing he'd been fooled by a sophisticated Allied deception network. In a way, he had been, just not the kind anyone expected. The sophistication wasn't in the props, it was in understanding that fear and uncertainty would do more work than craftsmanship ever could. That a commander, under pressure, doesn't ask whether something is real. He asks whether he can afford to assume it isn't.